Good morning, everyone. My name is Paul Reid. I'm with Interset. I'm a technology strategist there. And we're going to talk today in this first presentation about some of the things we're seeing in our customer environments when there's red team attacks, right? We do red team attacks because we don't always know the bad guys are after us, right? We got to keep on our toes and stay polished. But also, too, it's a good chance to practice what we would do if there was an attack. Just quick show of hands, how many people here have had red team attacks in their environment? Anybody? A few? Did you catch it?
Actually, I was part of the red team.
So my personal experience in dealing with some large Fortune 500 companies is they're not very successful with red team attacks. They really aren't, right? The red team really has the advantage because not only do they know they're going to do the attack, the blue teams don't, but also too, the red teams often know the lay of the land ahead of time, right? So they're given a lot of inside information about what can take place and what they can do and what their objectives are going into it, right? They're not going in blind. So it's really interesting. In my conversations, when we deploy our technology, we hear from them, this is the first time we've ever caught a red team, right? It's the first time we haven't been up on the wall of shame, right? With our monitors owned by the red team telling us how bad we are. So I'm going to talk through some of the ones we've seen and some of the things that, we've been able to pick up on and actually be able to understand how the attack went down. So we'll talk just quickly about our solution. Right? We were really about how do we take billions of things, billions of events, and get you a handful of actionable security leads. Our threat hunters are some of our most valuable resources. And having them spend their time on a hypothesis-based method of saying, I think we have this type of attack going on in our environment. I'm going to go look for it. Most of the time, they don't find that, right? They're not very successful, and they spend a lot of time going down a lot of rabbit holes where there's nothing there. But if we can give them a handful of things every day and go, you know what? Here's where you start. Here's where we're seeing strange activity. Maybe there's something there. Maybe we should dig into this more and understand what's taking place. So we do this again through unsupervised machine learning. We've had a number of sessions this week about that, right? So basically, we learn in your environment what normal looks like, right? So it's not ahead of time we say, this is good, this is bad. Hope you're good and bad look like what we think it is. It's not that way. We deploy, we understand what's happening in your environment, we understand the behaviors that take place, and then we measure against those behaviors as they change. As they change, we give you a measure of how risky something is or how bad something is, right? It's really up to you to determine if it's risky or not. Well, we tell you how much different it is than what it was before. So really, it's about bringing in that data from a bunch of different data sources. Today, we're really going to be talking a lot about endpoint data, which is what we see a lot of companies using to detect these type of attacks. And here's the steps we're going to go through. We acquire that data, we create those unique baselines, right? And that's really important to understand is that we know what your behavior is compared to the other entities in your organization, right? How do I interact with server A versus server B? It can be very different, right? So we want to have unique baselines for that. We then detect, measure, and score the anomalies. We'll talk a bit about that in the demo we're going to see. And again, those high quality security leads. We want to give you things that you can go off and look at. Along the way, too, we'll also kind of help you try to determine what type of attacks are taking place, right? Is an account compromised, is account misuse, is an infected host? Just to give you a feel of what we think might be going on. Okay, so let's talk about some ones. Let's first talk about a password guessing attack that a red team did. So the first indication we had that something strange was going on was that we saw these strange authentications take place against an OA server. We saw a large number of plain text password authentications against OA. Very unusual, right? We don't want plain text passwords moving across our network. And what we come to find out is there's a really common method to use for account enumeration and reconnaissance because you get a different timing response back from OA if the account exists or not, right? So I think they did about 25,000 different guesses against this to try to build a list of usernames. What we started seeing was we had a user that installed Python. It was very unusual for them to do that, right? So immediately, we have a normal user who's installed Python. We can actually see the raw events in the logs themselves on what was being done. We've blacked out some of the identifying information. So again, installed Python and the necessary libraries to conduct their attack. We then see them run this command. This is a live off the land type of thing. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to see what RDP sessions are currently active on that server. Again, getting a list of names, verifying the list of names that they have. And then they actually go off and try to create some sessions on the corpus server using command key, which was kind of interesting to see. So we see some of that early reconnaissance taking place, some of that early testing to see if their methods are going to work. One of the fascinating things we find is that the number one attack tool attackers like to use is notepad.exe, right? A lot of times they will just use text files, especially if they're doing reverse shells, right? So they use something like PowerSplit, which we'll talk a bit about, and they bring information back. It's always in text files. They run Notepad. Nobody ever monitors Notepad, right? Who cares, right? How important information can be in a text file? But as we see here, they actually use the text files to monitor their scripts and see what passwords are working, which ones aren't. So they actually kick off Python. Again, we found it was unusual for them to run Python. And they executed the script 28 times and then followed along in the text files. They're checking the results. Here's Notepad again. They see the results, refine the script, execute it again. And then we started getting these large numbers of anomalies created, right? In this case, we had how many there? 260 processes created. Normally 11 processes in an hour is what we'd expect. Kind of significant, right? Kind of different. But if you actually look at the commands being issued by Python, it was the following one at the bottom. They're trying to do a net use against their corporate server with the default password everyone's given when they join the company. And then those hash marks represent the usernames they were passing in from the OA enumeration they did. Then we got some larger anomalies. They had some confidence their script was running. Then we see it running 28,104 processes. Now they're really starting to stand out, right? That is very different than the 15.3 processes we expect to see. So again, these are the type of things we see take place, right? We have no idea how the attack's taking place, but we know it's something different. We know that the behaviors are going to change because an attack is happening. And then there's even more larger anomalies. They keep running. Here we got 14,000 anomalies. On October 20th, November 5th, they spent time reviewing their results in the text files. They then modified their script, and they kicked it off again, this time with a file named newtest.py. Thank you for letting us know. Right? A lot of times we find attackers and even bad guys do some very obvious things with how they name their tools and their output files. They make it very easy sometimes to understand how they're actually doing things. So again, they kick off Python, and we see continued attacks against the corporate server for remote network sessions. Okay, any questions about that? Seems pretty obvious looking back at it now. This was endpoint data. CrowdStrike. This is CrowdStrike Falcon data for this. Yeah. So again, this was actually a smaller part of a 3-month-long red team attack. I didn't have time to list that all out, but just to give you some background, there was like I said, a 3-month attack against this customer of ours, and halfway through the attack, they launched a second red team attack. The idea behind it, when we talked to the company, was their team had some feeling that a persistent attack was taking place over the past few months, and they wanted to simulate what would happen if some bad guys found out that they were already on an attack, and they wanted to attack at the same time too. Right? So you already have you guys busy looking over here, something bad's happening, and then all of a sudden someone pops up over here and starts doing something. So in the middle of our looking at this over this period of time, all of a sudden we saw these new anomalies come up, and at first we thought they're kind of related, but then we saw that the methods being used and the accounts being used were very different. So it was actually an attack inside of an attack. So that one was pretty neat. That one was pretty cool. This one was really interesting too. This one's very recent as well. Let's see here. April to February of this year, we ingested about 970 million events. We found 20 active risky entities. And of those 20 risky active entities, about 7 of them were actually related to the red team attack. The others were just like general background type of activity, bad IT hygiene, things like that. So what did we see? So one of the first anomalies we found was this account here by Jason used PowerShell. It was slightly unusual for him to use PowerShell, but it stood out to us. When we looked at the PowerShell commands being used, you see the last one there, get local admin to csv.ps1. That PowerShell script was actually left behind by some auditors who had come in to audit their network. So when the bad guys got in, they compromised Jason's account very quickly, and then they enumerated the things he had access to on his system, and they found this get local admin to CSV. So a lot of their work was done for them. So they actually ran that to get a list of all the local admin users across the network. So yeah, note to self, auditors come in, make sure they clean up after themselves. Next thing we saw was a lot of WMI activity, and we got that through the logon type 3s. So that again is network type of activity. And what happened was when they compromised Jason's account, he also had an associate administrator account. And we believe the way they got the password for this was that once they were on their machine, they dumped the hive, ran something like Mimikatz on it, got the hash, got the password, and then started using Jason's admin account to move laterally through the organization. We'll actually see they move between a couple of machines. I've hidden the machine names. They're actually WCO and then a bunch of numbers, and they actually move across 3 different machines during this attack. One of the things we saw, which was very interesting, was very unusual for this one workstation to run PowerShell. So when we went and looked at the PowerShell, we got this big, huge encoded blob, right? If you decode that with base64, you get another PowerShell script, and it has a huge array with more obfuscated PowerShell in it. You deobfuscate that PowerShell, and you come to find out that they're actually building a DLL with PowerShell from scratch using opcodes, which is pretty cool. So those opcodes are actually built to impersonate a Intel update, and we'll see that in a second. So one of the things they did was they pushed out PowerShell to all the machines to this Intel directory, and they renamed it updater.exe. So again, it was slightly unusual for them to use command.exe, but if you look at command.exe, what it actually executed, it was this updater.exe. Now, a couple of things here give it away right away, right? The command line arguments, right? That's pretty standard PowerShell, right? You wouldn't normally see an updater using PowerShell commands. So that kind of gave it away. Of course, when we dropped the hash of updater.exe into things like VirusTotal.net, and lo and behold, came back as PowerShell. So that was kind of interesting. So one of the questions we'll answer in a few minutes is why they picked on Intel. It was actually kind of interesting why they picked on Intel. This slide's mislabeled. It should say unregistering a legitimate DLL for a malicious DLL. So one of the things they did was they actually unregistered this Intel firmware.dll from the machines, because when they built their attack tool from PowerShell with the opcodes, it was actually named this, and then they re-registered it on everyone's machine. One of the things they were trying to do in this organization was they're trying to determine a trust relationship. They're trying to figure out which machines they could get to which domains on. So whenever they got onto a machine, they ran this series of commands to try to understand where they could get to. And they had an ultimate goal of trying to get to a certain machine to exfiltrate data from it. So they finally got to the right machine to exfiltrate the data. If you look at the command line here, it's actually dn exfil. So why would they tell us that they're using DNS to exfil the data? What we found out later on was when they ran the original attack using the Intel firmware.dll, that some of their internal tools inside the organization never caught that they're actually using DNS exfil. So the CISO and the head of the red team, who are kind of acting like the purple team, asked the red team to redo the attack again, this time renaming it to DN exfil, so that when they went and looked in the logs, they know exactly that they'd use DNS exfil the data. So it's kind of interesting. I don't know if you can see the actual destination they sent it to. They sent it to xf.cx. CX, if anyone recognizes that, that's actually Christmas Island. So I guess Santa Claus stole their data. So it's kind of interesting to see this. This was their ultimate goal, was to exfil their data. And so in one of their daily briefings, we'll get to that in a second. So why the Intel updates? One of the things the bad guys did was they scanned all those machines once they had the credentials for them, and they found that there was an open share in all the machines to the Intel directory, because they were using that share in all the machines to push out, network driver updates, but also to allow the bad guys to figure out how they're going to distribute their malware to everyone's machine. So one of the other questions they got asked was, could you defeat the CrowdStrike Falcon EDS system, right? Could you find some way to work around it? And we actually caught them trying to disable the CrowdStrike sensor on a number of machines, and they all failed, right? We saw them attack the sensor, but the sensor was never disabled. So that was kind of interesting. So they went that extra step. So just to overview it, we had some obfuscated PowerShell. We only investigated as far as we could. We didn't actually run the PowerShell ourselves, because it'd probably be a bad idea to do that. They ran their attack tools out of Intel directory, because that was the open share on everyone's machine. DNXFill, send information to Christmas Island. The actual attack tool was called Intel_firmware_3.23.6.dll. And they also used the updated.exe PowerShell as well. Things I didn't show you was they actually disabled Sophos on all the machines. And reconnaissance took place using WMI, looking for the administrator accounts and leveraging them that they found. And they also did some reconnaissance through a guest account. We could never be 100% sure it was them using it, but we did see a large number of guest logins take place, which was very interesting. They couldn't tell us why that had happened. Any question about that before I hop into a demo? Yes?
Was this a nation-state attack, like a corporate attack?
So it was supposed to simulate a nation-state attack by the Red Team, because this is a very prominent organization. They're a multinational organization who this attack was done against. It's supposed to simulate that type of idea. Really a true live off the land, right? Don't download anything that you don't need to type of thing. They did a pretty good job, but we caught it. Just for the record, we're 4 for 4. We haven't missed one yet. There's been some pretty interesting ones take place. Any other questions about this, sir?
Yeah, during your slides, I noticed you had the anomaly score up there.
Yep.
So for most of this demo, most of them were fairly low.
Yes.
So what was the trigger that eventually caused somebody on the blue team to go, hey, there's something
Yeah.
wrong here, let's go backtrack this user and
Yeah.
actually go begin?
Yeah, so in editing the slides, that got left on the cutting room floor. What it was the unusual login by Jason's admin account to a number of machines they never logged into before.
Okay.
And they were very high-risk events. And when we looked at those, we then started seeing associated events on that machine, right? We were able to pivot to that machine, and that's where we saw PowerShell run. We went, oh, that's interesting. Then when we looked at the PowerShell, it was like, oh, this is very interesting, right? So that was kind of our key to detect the actual initial attack. What was really fascinating about this, we didn't have time to show on the slides, was we also detected the blue team responding to the attack. So their blue team actually went to the machines, copied the bad DLL to a zip file, never done that before, downloaded to the machines, opened the zip file, never done that before. The leader of the blue team went to the NSA, because they just released that new decompiling tool, I can't remember the name of it. And he downloaded that, downloaded Java, downloaded all the libraries. So we actually saw them responding to the attack, which was kind of neat. And they really thought that was kind of cool, that not only did we see the red team attack, but we saw the blue team change their behaviors in response to the attack. That was kind of neat. Other questions?
What was necessary to prepare Interset for this kind of reconnaissance?
So we were already ingesting their Falcon EDR data into our system. And as it was coming in, we'd come in after the attack had taken place, because we were doing a historical proof of concept for them, because they were looking at using our technology. And when we ingested that date range of data, they said to us, did you see anything interesting? We're like, well, yes, we saw these very interesting events. Actually, we found 158 different anomalies that we identified as potentially threatening activity, and they confirmed all 158 were actual red team activity, which was kind of neat for them to see that. So that's kind of how we did it. It was just out-of-the-box models, nothing special. Just being able to interpret the results as they came in and being able to make those connections that, Jason logged into a machine never logged into before, pivot to that machine, runs PowerShell, never run PowerShell before, look at the PowerShell, it's obfuscated. It's a really good starting point to be able to find a red team attack. Any other questions? All right, I'm going to do a quick demo here. Just give you a flavor of how our tool works. And if you want to see more detail, you're welcome to join us down in the demo area. So let me just switch over here. All right. So this is the initial landing page for the tool. So it gives you some idea of how many events were analyzed, violations found, and active risk entities found. So again, going from billions of things down to a handful of a few things. We see that. Depending upon the data sources being ingested, different entities light up, right? So if we ingest endpoint data, we'll get things like users and machines and controllers and IP addresses. But if we bring in things like Active Directory, we may get printers and projects and resources shares. We'll be able to bring in web proxies. So all those different entities will light up based upon the data sets being ingested. So in this example, I'll go ahead and look at our users. And we'll see that we got a list of 12 extreme risky users here. And we'll just look at the first one here. We'll look at Joshua. So from Joshua, we get some initial information about it. We think the potential threat was initial access. And the highest risk anomaly was this unusual working hours. It was fairly anomalous for Joshua to have that. So let's actually look at his risk profile over time. So you see 30 days here. And we see for the past 30 days, Joshua has been fairly benign. Not much of interesting things happen, but just lately, his risk score has really gone up quite substantially, almost from 0 up to 100. So I'm just going to take and zoom into this interesting area here. And now I get all the anomalies that took place during this time frame. And when we look at anomalies, we kind of put them in a few buckets, from like low risk anomalies all the way to extreme risk anomalies. When I start my threat hunting, I always like to kind of peel the onion, right? I want to start with the highest risk events first. And do I get enough information from those high risk events? Or do I have to go down to the next level and take that onion down one more level? So let's go ahead and let's do that. Let's start with the high risk events here for Joshua. So just use the slide here. Now I have all his high risk events over this time period. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work backwards in time. I'm going to work from like the earliest date to today's date, just to get a chronological idea of what Joshua did. Yes, Joshua. So let's start off by looking here. So we see that Joshua sent 767 megabytes in an hour to a legit.com website. Doesn't sound made up at all, legit.com. So what's interesting about this is a first access, right? And the first time you go to a place is one of those interesting, what we call rare events. And rare events can quite often give you a lot of detail about the type of behaviors taking place, because it's a really unique behavior. And what we see is that generally, when people go to a website the first time, they only upload about 26.7K, right? Which kind of makes sense, right? You connect to a website the first time, just going to look around, see what's happening, what's going on. But we see that Joshua actually sent 767 megabytes in an hour. And I can actually go in and look at the events that made that up. And in fact, I can go one step further. I can see the actual raw events behind this, right? As Stefan likes to say, we have principled mathematics behind us. We can actually see the events that make up our results, right? So you can actually verify our results for yourself. One of the nice things I love about Kibana is you get that quick graph at the top, that time series graph. And quite often as a threat hunter, that's all you really need to see to understand what's taking place, right? So I can go through here and look at all the individual fields and records and that, but I can tell you just from experience, I'm sure other people in the room recognize it as well, that this does not look like human activity, right? It's happening at the top of the hour, 2 minutes, 4 minutes, 6 minutes, 8 minutes. You ever known any human that can click that accurately? Not really, right? Right? There's not a lot of entropy taking place here, right? This looks like pretty measured, regular, automated type of activity taking place, right? So already my gut tells me it's probably not Joshua doing this, right? There's probably something doing it on behalf of his account. All right, so let's go back and see what else we have taking place. We then see after that it was very unusual for Joshua to work in this time period, right? So we get this beautiful graph here, and what you see is a series of these gray rays. The longer the ray is and the more closer it is to the edge, the more probabilistic it is that he's active that time of day, right? And that's based upon all the activity we bring in from all the different data sources to understand exactly how Joshua's behaving. This black ray we see here is what we actually observed. So we can see that it's very, very different than what we'd expect Joshua to be working. So already we know a bunch of stuff, right? There's something automated going on, and it's happening at a time of day that Joshua is not normally active. All right, what else took place? We then see that he has a larger number of logins in an hour compared to others. So compared to other people like him, they typically log in 2 times an hour at most, and we actually saw him log in 31 times in an hour, right? Humans are lazy, right? We don't want to do anything more than we have to, right? Do you really want to log in 31 times in an hour? No, none of us log in 31 times in an hour. So clearly there's something else going on here. This is not Joshua doing this, right? And it's probably not a human doing it either. 31 times an hour, that's a lot of logins. All right, what else do we see take place? We then see that it was very unusual for Joshua to access a shared drive called client data 38 times in an hour. Joshua typically accesses it 1 time in an hour and at most 2 times in an hour. So again, very, very different than what we'd expect Joshua to be behaving. We also get this really great graph. Not sure how well you guys can see it. If we look at the average for Joshua is about 1, expected highest for Joshua is 2. Average for other users is about 1, expected high is 3. So Joshua is right in the middle of that peer group, right? It's not like he's an outlier or something very unique about him. So the fact that we see him do it 38 times in an hour, that tells me there's something very different taking place here. As we go along, we then see that he accesses 19 unique projects in an hour, right? And a unique project could be a library in SharePoint, it could be a file folder in a source code repository, and that's kind of how we look at projects, right? And there's a lot of really great information we get out of repository access, right? There's a lot of really rich behaviors that take place there, and if you want to hear more about that, you can talk to us afterwards, but really, there's some very interesting things we see there. And again, we see what the average is for Joshua, expected highs. He's a little bit under that. We observed 19, so it's a little bit different, but not too much. So again, something unusual taking place. We then see this unusual for him to work in this time of day, right? Very similar to the graph we looked at earlier. We see that he did a large number of take actions, right? He's taking more information from those locations than he normally does. So again, that's a very strong indicator that something unusual is taking place here, right? We have a natural ratio of gives and takes, right? When we see that get out of whack, that's quite indicative of something bad taking place. Again, he works at an unusual hour, not surprising based upon what we saw earlier. But also, too, we have this really interesting post event that takes place. We see that Joshua sent 1.3 gigabytes an hour using post, significantly larger amount of data compared to normal, right? Josh would generally post about 821 kilobytes. So again, significantly different than what we're expecting Joshua to do. Now, something very interesting happens in this example. If I go and take a look at the raw events this time, and we actually jump into Kibana and we have it load up the results for us, we see a very different graph this time, right? This looks a lot more human-like, right? A lot more entropy, a lot more randomness in what's taking place here, right? So again, this upload behaves very different than that first legit website we went to, right? So again, very, very different. Lastly, we see that some of these files being uploaded triggered a violation of credit card data. So one of the things we can do is we actually have a data enrichment framework, and we can bring in violations and alerts from other systems and use it as part of the risk profile for a user. So in this case, our DLP told us that there was a credit card data tried to be transmitted 75 times and it was blocked, right? So those files didn't get uploaded. So just based upon these events here that I just saw, can I come to a fairly good conclusion about what took place? I would think so, right? It's probably safe to say at some point in the past, Joshua's account got compromised, right? Some piece of malware got put onto his machine. It did some automated analysis and uploaded some files to a command and control server. Some baddie looked at those files, connected back into that piece of malware, probably acting as a rat now. Poked around a bit more, found some more stuff, tried to upload some stuff with some credit card files on it, and it got blocked. So from this, we can probably assume that 1, it's not Joshua. 2, Joshua needs to change his password, and we should make sure that nothing else leaked out in terms of PII beyond that credit card information that was blocked. Any other questions I can answer for you, or anything else you'd like to talk about? We got a few minutes left before we move on. All right, well, thank you guys very much. I appreciate you coming to such an early morning session. Thank you.